Hi everybody, Jay the Fish Guy here on location today at Rob's 500-gallon SPS reef. You really can't appreciate this thing unless you're here in person, but I'm going to do my best to show you all sorts of cool corals in his tank today. We're going to take a little tour of his equipment room, and the main reason I'm here today is actually we're doing some fragging for a couple of my other clients that have interest in some of his awesome SPS frags. I'm going to do a little video. We're going to speed it up, and while I'm doing the fragging, we're also going to just talk about fragging SPS in general. So stay tuned, and thanks for watching.
So Rob's had this tank up and running for about 2 years now. And he's got a lot of great pieces in here. He probably spent the first year acquiring most of these. Some of them were smaller mini colonies. Others he picked up that were a little bit larger. And that was the first year. And then the second year to the present is just been letting them all grow and color up and fill in. And now we're at the point where fragging is kind of a necessity, where a lot of these pieces are growing into one another, and kind of have to do some fragging to keep the piece, so to speak. But he's done a great job, and things are looking really, really good in this setup. All right, so here we have his lighting setup. He has 4 Kessel AP700s and 6 Kessel 360WEs. This gives him the coverage that he needs. The tank is 32 inches front to back, so a single layer of lights weren't going to cut it. These guys are turned up to almost max, I believe, and run for about 12 hours a day, slowly ramping up. First the 700s, then the 360s fill in, and then slowly ramping back down at the end of the day. All right, so here we are in the equipment room directly below the tank, and you can see he's got quite a bit of stuff in here, everything he needs to take care of this big reef tank. So starting here on the left, we have his large return pump. It's a Reef Flow Hammerhead Gold that provides all the flow for the tank, as well as all the flow for the reactors and other little equipment. So he's got a 5-channel doser, which he had been using up to this point, and he's recently switched over to a calcium reactor. A little more on that in a bit. Here we have his refugium, which is plumbed inline. That it's roughly about 100 gallons, I think, by the time you're all said and done. He has Chaeto in the middle there. It needs to be pruned out, but it grows very, very well for him. I'm not a big refugium guy, but he wanted to do it, and it's been working well for him. So that's the refugium. Here we have his new calcium reactor. This thing is just gigantic. I forget how many pounds of media it took, but it was quite a bit to fill up this reactor. And you can see the CO2 system there as part of it, and the controller unit with the stepper motor you can see running that controls how much effluent is going into the tank. This is the first sump where all the water drops down in. He has a Coral View Reef Octopus, I think it's a Regal 300 if I remember correctly is what we got him. It has a neck cleaner on it that's all automated on a timer, and then it discards through that pipe there and goes into a 5-gallon bucket to collect the skimmate. The sock system is less than ideal, but he likes it and he makes it work for him. It makes it very quick and easy, I guess, for him to take the old socks off and put the new socks on. Here we have his reactors. He has a biopellet reactor. He's got one for carbon and then one for GFO. You can see the plumbing just kind of comes through the wall there, and that's a feed line off of the main return. All the major plumbing is hidden behind the wall in his open basement there that try to keep things as neat as possible inside the room. This is a 300-gallon holding tank, which he makes his salt water up for his water changes. You can see the pump there and the tubing that goes around the wall. He's able to actually do drain and fills without having to do any buckets, or he just opens a valve and pumps and just lets it drain and lets it fill, and he's all done. All right, so now that we've had a chance to take a look at Rob's system and get a little bit updated with that, we're going to talk a little bit about fragging of SPS corals, and this kind of applies to branching LPS corals because I was doing a hammer coral today as well, a branching hammer. So I always get customers that are scared to even attempt to frag their SPS. And I understand the hesitation. If you're new to it and you haven't done it before, it can be kind of scary to start hacking up your prized coral that you've been growing for months or potentially years. But I'm here today to let you know that it doesn't have to be scary. These corals are surprisingly resilient despite what we know. We know that they can be delicate in terms of water parameters, but in terms of physical trauma, meaning you're cutting them, you're breaking them up, you're gluing them down, if you're going from same water parameters start to finish, meaning you take the coral out, or if you have to do it in the tank, you're cutting them in the tank, you're gluing them, and then you're putting them back in the same water, there's actually very, very little stress involved. So I'm going to touch base on how the whole process works a little bit today. If you guys want to see a video, a little more in-depth kind of fragging tutorial, let me know down in the comments section and I'll be happy to make that happen. I just want to kind of do more of a broad overview today since we have so much of the video being taken up by Rob's tank overview here. So let's start. All right, so the basics. What do I use when I'm chopping up these corals? Well, they have some commercially available coral cutters, and I'll put a picture up here on the screen of what I'm talking about. They work great. They might be a little overpriced, but a lot of them are made out of stainless. They don't rust very easily. And I mean, I've had a couple of pairs that I've literally had for years. I even have a pair that has like a black, quote-unquote, titanium finish to it that's even better in terms of durability and longevity. But the big thing is to rinse them in fresh water after you're done so that they don't have a tendency to rust up or seize up on you. So a good set of coral cutters. I've used various like clipper style pliers as well in a pinch if I had to, if I needed something a little bit bigger or heavier duty. Some of these SPS branches on the older colonies can get quite thick, so even the large coral cutters just aren't quite enough. So usually I don't cut with these. I know that sounds kind of a little bit weird, but I'll grasp it firmly like I'm going to cut and kind of start to dig into it a little bit, and then I'll actually, with a sideways motion, snap off the branch. This is great for smaller diameter branching species. It allows you to still hang on to the frag with the cutter after you snap, as opposed to cutting straight through and clipping through. Then the coral frag actually falls to the bottom. And as you can imagine on this bigger tank here that I'm working on, if that happens, you need to get a set of tongs or actually like dive right in and try to grab it. But if it falls down between the rocks in the back, you're pretty much done and you have to clip another piece. So by doing the just barely cut and then twist, you're able to snap the piece off. You're still holding on to it, and you can just pull it right out of the tank. So that's usually how I end up having to do most SPS frags. For the thicker branching ones, like I was mentioning, if you use a thicker, bigger, heavier duty set of cutters, the same concept applies, but you may actually have to physically cut through on those, and just hopefully you're doing it in an area where you're able to collect the frag after the fact if need be. Some of them can actually be fairly dense and pretty hard to cut through. This is, of course, if you're doing it in the tank, so say your colony has attached firmly to the rock and you're not able to take it out. Under ideal conditions, you'd be able to actually take the colony and its little rock out and do it right on the countertop, and you can kind of get a better view 360 on, which piece you want to cut off, which branch. So next thing we'll talk about, how big of a piece should you cut off? I usually don't mess with anything less than an inch. And the reason for that is the bigger the piece, the faster it starts growing again. And ideally, I'll pick a branch that has actually started to fork, so you get kind of two branches in one. And the frags tend to grow a lot faster if you get something that size. Anything less than an inch that seems to almost take twice as long to get going and to get growing again. And I've seen various forum posts and studies done where people have kind of scientifically did, okay, same coral, same tank, I make a frag this size and I make one double the size and track the growth rate. And, you know, people have done this time and again, and it just simply shows that that bigger frag is going to take off that much faster compared to the smaller one. So try to do at least an inch and closer to 2 inches if you can, ideally. So let's talk a little bit about mounting the corals after you've cut them off. So I see a lot of people doing stuff with the two-part epoxy. And my experience has really shown that you don't want to mess with the epoxy for SPS frags. I found that the epoxy, now whether it's the curing process or just the chemical makeup of the epoxy itself, is actually an irritant to the coral itself. So you put a little ball of epoxy, you shove the SPS frag into it, it attaches to that, the ball of epoxy attaches to the rock, seems win-win. But I've seen plenty of frags fail using this whole epoxy method. And I can only assume that it has to do with the epoxy itself and not the coral, because different tanks, different frags, and the common denominator was this epoxy, and it doesn't seem like the way to go. So what I'll usually use is a thicker super glue gel. I'll put a little dollop on the rock itself. This is, of course, out of the tank. Piece of paper towel, or a lot of times I use the lid of a styrofoam container, just because it has a lip and it tends to hold any excess water that comes off. So you have your piece of rubble, you dry it off, or a frag plug if you're so inclined, if you're using frag plugs. Dry it off with a paper towel. Dry off the end of the frag that's going to be mounted with the super glue. Dry that off, and you put a little dollop onto your frag plug or piece of rubble, and you firmly press and hold the SPS frag to the dollop of super glue. Kind of count to 10. A lot of times I'll quickly dip it in a small cup of salt water that I have nearby. The salt water actually speeds up the curing process on the super glue, and that way it'll actually be able to hold the frag in place. And I'll just kind of set it down in my little workspace and give it a good solid minute before putting it back into the tank or into your little frag setup, whatever you happen to be doing. Make sure the flow is turned way down or turned off in the tank when you go to put it back in for at least a good 15-20 minutes. That'll give the super glue time to really set, and that way you don't accidentally blow your freshly made frag right off the piece of rubble or the frag plug. So a little tip there. And that's really it. I like using rubble instead of the frag plugs. One, because I have a ton of it. Every time I do a live rock order, I always have a ton of rubble in the bottom of the boxes, and I tend to keep it. I got a large styrofoam container full of it, and I break it into smaller pieces. It looks more natural, for one, and for two, it's a little bit easier to work with. A lot of the rubble has little nooks and crannies, and you can actually stick the frag in that little nook and cranny to make sure it's a lot more of a solid mount. Whereas if you're mounting to a frag plug or a frag disc, it's a flat surface. It doesn't really want to stay on it. It can be done, and I've done it plenty. It's just my personal preference is to use the bits of rubble. The same process applies to any branching LPS species like hammers or torches, even Duncans, same thing, the whisker corals. So you'll cut the branch and then mount it to the rubble in the same fashion with the super glue. You can use epoxy on those because the branching portion that you're cutting off is generally dead skeleton. You can use the epoxy to really, solid mount it if you're concerned that the super glue isn't really holding enough. Again, rubble is the best way to go, especially if you can find one with a little natural pocket or a cubby that you can glue it in place or epoxy it in place, and it's less likely to move around. And speaking of that, for all frags, but especially SPS, if they're in a frag rack or they're in your rockscape and you can see them wobbling in the flow. And I know that sounds funny, but if they're moving at all in the flow and just rocking where you have them placed, that's actually slowing down their growth. And I know that sounds funny, but these things can actually tell when something like that's happening. And it's obviously, if they're able to rock, they can easily get knocked over by a crab or a snail, which is even worse. So if you can solid mount that piece of rubble to your rock structure, and in this case you can use the epoxy. If it's small enough, you can generally use the super glue as well. But make sure that that thing is rock solid, pun intended, and not moving. And the growth rate will be significantly better than if it was left to just sit there and rock in the breeze, so to speak. Now, if they fall over, you might as well kiss a week to 2 weeks of growth goodbye. Just falling over, being in the sand bed for a few hours, and then having to pick them back up and putting them back on the rockwork, that sets them back like you wouldn't believe. So make sure these things are solid mounted and not going to go anywhere on you. All right, guys, that about wraps it up for today's video. We had a chance to look at Rob's great 500-gallon SPS reef and get a little more in-depth detail about his lighting and his equipment room down below. And then we touched base a little bit on the fragging of SPS and LPS corals. Like I said, if you guys want to hear more about fragging and do a little more of a in-depth tutorial, let me know down in the comments section below. If you're not a subscriber, please click the subscribe button at the top of the screen. And as always, thanks for watching.